began our study in the Gospel of John several weeks back, we used this as our theme, experiencing Jesus in the gospel of truth. And we made the observation that the Gospel of John, as John writes, it toggles between these two realities, deep, rich experiences with Jesus, which stop, and then these massive sections where John just teaches us truth. And so we've been in chapter 6, which Jesus is about to get into some very significant truth next week. But to frame it, you have to have these two experiences. The first experience we looked at last week is where Jesus takes small loaves and bread and feeds these, 20,000 people. It was a test of their faith. And the second one found in verse 16. So take your Bible and turn to John chapter 6 and verse 16. John chapter 6 and verse 16. And one of the questions that this text raises for us is, why is it that we experience trials? Why do we experience suffering? And we answered a little bit of the question last week, although it's not the focal point. It's an important and interesting question that it brings up. Part of the answer is that Jesus Christ is going to come as the great host, Isaiah 25 tells us, and he's going to make all things right and provide sustenance for all people. And so when he provides for us in these little momentary trials that we have in this life, it's a foretaste, an appetizer of what's coming later. But here we have another story of Jesus providing. And this story is so significant, and I think is so helpful for us. I want to do something that we normally don't do. Normally we walk through the text and toward the end we say, okay, this is what it's about, kind of get to the idea. But I don't want to get to the idea of the text. I want to work from the idea. And so if you're taking notes, write it down right now. I'm just going to tell you right up at the top, here's what this text is about. Here's the idea. It's simply this: true disciples are entrusted with tests. True disciples are entrusted with tests. All right, so that's the first part. Here's the second part. True disciples are entrusted with tests so that we would know and trust Jesus. True disciples are entrusted with tests so that we would know and trust Jesus. Well, this little story, 16 through 21, has two scenes and it has a setting, all that's very, very significant. So let's jump into it. Here's the setting for our story. Verse 16, when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. So verse 17 is the bad news. It's dark, you're alone in a boat without Jesus. That's no place you want to be. And here's what's going on. Jesus just performed this miraculous miracle. But remember at the end, verse 15, they were trying to make him king by mob rule by force, and Jesus escapes away to the mountains. Evidently, he had planned ahead to meet his disciples at Capernaum because they just kind of default, get in a boat and go over. They're not hungry, of course, because they'd eaten probably the greatest meal they've ever had. It was prepared by Jesus himself. The crowd was standing around, whatever they're doing, they know they're not eating, of course, because they're totally satiated, totally full, because they'd been fed by the hands of Jesus himself, but they're looking for what their next move is. And there are two directional words. In verse 16, they went down, and then verse 17, they went across. So 12 down and 12 across. The disciples come down from the mountain and they go across. And they've just been feeling this incredible, literal mountaintop experience. They've been at the top of the mountain with Jesus. They've gone from an emotional high to now not even knowing where Jesus is. And so they're vulnerable at this point. And so it says in verse 16, when evening came, his disciples got into a boat. Let's stop and think about those two words, his disciples. Really, in a sense, all the people in chapter 6 that Jesus fed could be considered his disciples. Remember, he listed 5,000, but that was just the men, trying to draw an indication of kind of the mob that was there. Perhaps there was more like 10 or 20,000 that are there, but there weren't 20,000 people that got into a boat. This wasn't a cruise line, right? So what does he mean, his disciples? Well, that's a very, very important point. Why does he talk about Jesus having these 20,000 followers and then say his disciples got into a boat? Why does that make sense here in chapter 6? Well, look down at verse 30. Verse 30, let's skim and do a little, verse 25. Let's do a little Bible study to hopefully answer this question. When they found him on the other side, this is later when they're coming back to Jesus at the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you come? And Jesus answered them, truly, truly, I say to you, you are seeking me, not because you saw signs, because you ate your fill of the loaves. In other words, you're not after me to follow me. You're followers of me, but you're not following me. You're not there to worship. You're just here to watch. I provided you the best meal that you've ever had. It's logical that you would come back to me for more food, but I want you to know that I understand, whether you see it or not, the limits of what you're after. You're really after more food, what I can give you. So Jesus there is drawing a distinction between those that are truly following it and those that are just after something. Let's skip down to verse 41. That's the crowd that's following Jesus. But let's do this little Bible study. Skip down to verse 41. So the Jews grumbled about him because he said, I am the bread that came down from heaven. So there's people in the crowd that aren't sure about Jesus, but also the Jews. That's a shorthand for the leadership. They didn't like it because Jesus said, I'm the true bread that came down in heaven. And so when they didn't like that, when Jesus said, actually, when the bread came down from heaven that Moses gave, the manna that was actually speaking of me, what he does is he doubles down. And he said, well, actually, I'm not just the bread, but you understand you can't come to the Father unless you eat me. And so they got confused in this. And Jesus doubles down again. He says, well, yes, you must eat my flesh and drink my blood. And so look at verse 66. Here's what happens next. After this, many of his disciples turned back. Now that's crazy. That's an oxymoron. A disciple is a follower. So I don't think this irony is lost on John. The followers stopped following. The disciples turned back and walked with him. So Jesus spins on his heels, looks at the 12 and says to them, do you want to go away as well? So again, there's this huge distinction that's so clear in John between the true and the false. The followers and those that are truly following Jesus. Those that are there to watch and those that are there to worship. Those that are just in the crowd and people that are really seeking Jesus. And by the way, let me just stop and say it's so important. That's always the case. I had the opportunity to go to a phenomenal Christian college. Just a great, rich experience, but it was so clear that they're flying under the banner of Christ, that there are people that are just there to be a part of the crowd. They weren't there to follow Jesus. I went to this great Christian high school, so blessed like we have here in Little Rock, so many great Christian schools, but I'm assuming the kids in those Christian schools were like the ones in my Christian school. They were part of the crowd. It was their religious DNA, it was their heritage, but they weren't there to follow Jesus. And it's true when you have an organized body of believers. This is what the book of Hebrews tells us. Where it says, Hebrews chapter 2 and verse 1, be careful to focus on Jesus, because if you don't focus on Jesus, you might drift away. And what the writer of Hebrews is doing is he's looking to a local group of people and he's saying, you know what, I think that there's a church here, but this church is surrounded by a crowd. And the crowd of people aren't really interested in knowing about Jesus. They're interested in worshiping Jesus. Their point is not to give their entire life to Jesus. They're just there for the show, the music, and the fellowship, and the fact that this is just what you do because we live in Little Rock and we're good people, good Christian people. We go to church, but not really of the true church. In other words, they would not find themselves in the boat there, not the true 12. And I'm not trying to get off on a tangent and get away from the story. I'm bringing this up because as we see next week, that really is the big thrust of chapter 12, when Jesus is drawing a line between true and false believers. So those 12, those are the ones that got into the boat. And here's what happens. Look at verse 18. Still in the setting of the story, the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing, and the Sea of Galilee is surrounded by mountains. And so what happened was this hot air would come down from the mountains and mix with the cool air of the waters, and it would just cause these swells to come up on the water. And so quickly, they didn't get into rough seas, it became rough. This water just swelled up. And they hadn't done anything wrong. It's not like they made a stupid decision. It's not like they did something foolhardy. They weren't being foolish. That's not the point at all. The point is that sometimes when you are following Jesus, trials come. So here you have true disciples entrusted with trials. And that's the setting for the story. So what is Jesus going to do in this situation? They can't do anything. What is Jesus going to do? Well, look at this first scene of the story. Look at verse 19. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Oh, so they can't do anything, so Jesus comes to them. The boat doesn't come to Jesus, Jesus comes to the boat. That's a significant detail in the story. And when Jesus comes up to the boat, they found that they had already been rowing about 3 or 4 miles. Now that sounds good, except we know from Mark and Matthew that they'd been rowing a long time. So this was a slog. It was a frustrating, slow rowing. Their arms were probably tired. We know from other gospel writers they were probably frightened. John doesn't include those details, and that's significant that he doesn't. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the point is they had this frustrating rowing experience. Then this perpetual storm. They're doing the best they can, and Jesus walks up. And why are they frightened? Well, they're frightened because they've seen somebody walk on the water. There's no mystery there. Is this a ghost? Is this some kind of spirit? What is this? We've never seen somebody walk on the water. Now, what is Jesus doing in this moment? Well, to me, this is the crux of the issue. Not to me, this is the crux of the issue. Jesus doesn't calm the storm here. And he doesn't even calm his disciples. He just walks up to them and he begins to, if I can use this word, he begins to preach. He has this 2 major points that he wants to communicate, 2 major declarations. The first thing that Jesus declares is he declares his sovereignty. The water is now a footpath for Jesus. He totally suspends gravity. Now, why does he do this way? We don't know, but it makes for us a very, very interesting Exodus connection. Remember, we talked about all the Exodus connections in this text of Scripture, that Jesus was up on a mountain, Moses was up on a mountain. Jesus gave them bread from himself. In Exodus, God gives bread from heaven. But the big miracle of Exodus, only second to the Passover, and Jesus is the Passover lamb, is that Moses raised his staff and parted the water. But it wasn't Moses that parted the water, it was God. Jesus was there. So here's this huge connection. In Exodus, Jesus holds back the water, but in John, the water holds him. And here he comes walking out of the water, and when Jesus is walking on the water, and what he's doing, he's declaring his sovereignty over all things. There was nothing scarier to them than the ocean, than the waters. And Jesus says, I have all authority over those things that are troubling you. So Jesus is declaring his sovereignty and he's declaring his authority over all things. But here's the second thing that Jesus wants to communicate, the second point of his sermon. And this is so important. The second thing he wants to declare is not just his authority and his sovereignty, but he wants to declare his identity. Now watch this. Go back to the text. Verse 20 says, but he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Now, I want us to turn to Exodus chapter 3, if you will. Exodus chapter 3, we're going to come right back to John. But look at Exodus chapter 3, and I want to show you something very, very significant. John, as you're turning to Exodus chapter 3, is significant because he includes 7 signs in the book. There's the turning of the water and the wine. There's the healing of the nobleman's son, the healing of the paralytic, the bread, of course, that is multiplied, the walking on the water. Then later he's going to turn a blind man to enable him to see. And then finally the resurrection of the dead. Has 7 signs that go throughout the Gospel of John. And while we haven't talked about it a lot, these 7 signs around these also are the 7 I am sayings of Jesus. So such as I am the bread of the world, I'm the light of the world, I am the bread of life, I am the resurrection and the life, I am the door, John 15, I am the good shepherd. So Jesus makes these 7 I am statements. And they're rooted here in Exodus chapter 3, and this is the biggest connection to Exodus. But Exodus chapter 3 is the story of Moses and the burning bush. You remembered it. We studied it not long ago, where God appears in a burning bush to Moses and tells him to go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And Moses asks the next obvious question, I'm nobody when I go to Pharaoh. Whom shall I say sent me? In what name am I asking Pharaoh to make this massive political move? So this is verse 13. Look at Exodus 3:13. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and they say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. And if that wasn't confusing enough, and he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am sent me to you. Well, that's what you call a non-answer, right? God, could you tell me the name that I'm going to give them that's going to let them know that you're truly the God of Israel? To which God answers, I am. It's a definitive statement of authority. Why doesn't he just give him a name? Because if you know somebody's name, you know something about them. You know something about their character. You know something about who they are. And it was God's way of saying, you say to the people, and you say ultimately to Pharaoh, you don't know me. You can't touch me. You have no authority over me. I am. And literally, and the Hebrew says this, Jesus or God told Moses, I am who I am. I am who I am. I'm totally self-contained. I have all authority. I'm relying upon no one. No one knows me. I'm sovereign over all things. I am who I am. And so in one sense, it's frustrating because there's no name, but in another sense, it makes perfect sense. He's expressing the reality that no one can touch him. God stands above all. Now, what makes it so interesting in the Gospel of John is that this God who is unknowable, this God who is untouchable, this God who we can't even wrap our minds around, John tells us, John 1:14, that Jesus came to explain him. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us, and we beheld his glory, another Exodus connection, the glory of God. And so when John uses these I am statements, is his way of saying, look, this is God explained. What exactly did God mean when he said to Moses, I am? Well, Jesus explains it. He's the bread from heaven. He's the light of the world. He's the living water. He's the resurrection and the life. He's the door. He's the shepherd. Everything you wanted to know about God the Father is revealed in the person of Jesus Christ. I am all the things that God hinted at through his I am sayings of Jesus. And why are we bringing this up now? Well, because the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. You know this, right? So they were Hebrews, so it was written in the Hebrew language. But when we get to the New Testament, the Hebrews are living in a Greek culture, and so most of them spoke Aramaic or Greek as well as Hebrew. And they wrote the New Testament in Greek. So the Gospel of John is not written in Hebrew. It's written in the common language of the day, the Koine, the common Greek is what it's written in. And so when the Greeks were writing out the Old Testament, it's called the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew Old Testament, and they got to this phrase, I am who I am, Exodus 3:14, they wrote these two Greek words, ego, heimi. It literally means, I am, I am. Ego, I me. I am, I am. And I want us to turn to that because if you go back to John 6:20, when Jesus gets into the boat, my translation says, but he said to them, it is I. But this wasn't about identification, it was about declaration. When Jesus said, it is I, he said, ego, he me. He's saying, guys, I want you to put all this together. I am. Jesus gets to the boat and says, I am. And here's why this is so, I think, fascinating, important, significant, but also encouraging. It's because when Jesus gets to the boat, it's strange to me all that he doesn't do. So I was talking to my son yesterday, and I said, well, let me tell you this story. And frankly, I was doing it totally selfishly because if I could work out the sermon to him, maybe it would make sense. So I said, well, this story of where Jesus is getting into a boat. Oh, he just said, oh, I know this story. It's where he calms the sea. No, he doesn't calm the sea. Well, this is the story where he's sleeping and he encourages his disciples. No, he doesn't encourage his disciples. So I said to my son, what do you think Jesus would do after he gets in a boat and his disciples are there and they're following him and there's anything wrong and the storm comes up? What would he say to them? And he said, well, I think he'd encourage them. And I was like, well, that's what I would think. You think he'd go around and take them by the shoulders and say, hey, it's all right. Or like a coach, put his hand around their head and say, hey, it's okay. I mean, he says, don't be afraid. But outside of that, there's no sense that Jesus is walking around to each disciple and meeting their emotional needs. There's no sense he's having a breakthrough moment with them in which all their questions are going to be resolved. He doesn't do that. And the other thing Jesus doesn't do is he doesn't calm the storm. Could he have? Yes, but he doesn't. Why? Because he wants to do something bigger. He wants to do something better. He wants to do something more significant. He wants them to understand who he is. And so he gets in the boat and he says, I am. And the text says they were glad to see him. And they welcomed him in the boat. So let's look at the second scene. Look at verse 20. But he said to them, it is I, do not be afraid. Then they were going to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. So there's a question here. It says immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. The question that comes up is that another miracle? When Jesus steps into the boat, they've gone from this emotional high, being on the mountain, to this emotional low, to being down in this storm, and then Jesus comes, and they've been frightened, and then he appears to them, and then they look up, and they're there. Is that a way of just saying a lot of time passed? It could be. Or there could be another miracle. And the other miracle could be is that they look up, and, oh my, we're at land. And if that's the miracle, I think the point is this, is that when you recognize who Jesus is, you are where you want to go. In other words, you're there. So you understand there's a real sense in which Jesus doesn't answer what you would think would be their prayers. They're in a boat on a storm. Could Jesus come and calm the fears? He doesn't really do that. Could Jesus come and calm the sea? He doesn't really do that. Could Jesus come in, make the clouds go away, make the moon shine brighter and the stars shine brighter, and they just row that extra part? He doesn't do that. The point is that the destination to which Jesus wanted them to arrive was an understanding of who he was. I'm declaring to you my authority, my sovereignty over all things. I'm declaring you my identity, that I am the I am that I am. I am the one to whom Moses spoke of. I am he. And once you understand that, well, we're there. We're there. So 3 encouragements this morning by way of application. The first encouragement is this, that be encouraged that you are a true disciple. There's some of this, no matter how much we believe otherwise or teach otherwise, we just think that somehow if we are a true disciple of Jesus, that we will be insulated from storms and isolated from things that harm us. But understand, this is such an important point. These disciples have done nothing wrong. In fact, there's a sense from other gospels that there was some arrangement that they were going to find Jesus perhaps in Capernaum, so that's why they were going there. They were doing the right thing. When they got into the boat, it was not already storming, so they didn't do something foolish. One time we were out on the lake and a storm came up and there was these swells. It wasn't an ocean or lake, but these swells are maybe at least 4 foot high. And I saw a jet ski there, a Sea-Doo there that my father-in-law owned. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to take that out on those swells, just ride up and down? That would be really, really fun. So no one else was looking, so I did that. And of course, I rode the swells up, I rode them down under the dock, and it comes back up on top of the dock and smashes the Sea-Doo, and it gets a gouge on it, and he'll learn about it in the second service when he's here. My father-in-law will. Because in a public space, he can't hurt me, I think. It'd just be a good time for him to know this event that happened 12 years later. That was stupid. If I would have died, they would have said, oh, it's unfortunate, but you know, he did do that. Right? It's like the famous last words of a redneck, hey, watch this. But that's not the disciples. They've done nothing wrong. And even we can give them a pass for being afraid, right? Of course they were afraid. Look, Jesus is walking on the water toward them. Who wouldn't be frightened by that? They've done nothing wrong in this case. So listen very, very carefully. Just listen to this encouragement. True disciples are entrusted with trials. The crowd isn't experiencing this. The disciples, the 12, the followers, true disciples are entrusted with trials. But here's a second encouragement. There's an encouragement inside of this text to pray. I don't want to make too much of this because this is implicit, not explicit. It's not the driving point of the text, but it is significant that they were happy when they let Jesus inside the boat. And the rest of our New Testament unpacks for us that the reason why we pray, this is harking back to last week, the reason why we entrust things to Jesus is because he has everything that we need. Don't look around him like the disciples did when they were looking for bread and money. Look to Jesus. So if Jesus is all that we need, if he has everything we need, when we have Jesus in the boat, if we're praying and seeking him, bringing him into that situation, then we really have all that we need. Now those two encouragements are hinted at in the text, but this third one is explicit. It's the clear one. And that is this: you have to know and trust Jesus. You have to know and trust Jesus. So I don't know if there's any other way to say this, but just to be as blunt as possible, our endurance through the storms has somewhat to do with grit, has somewhat to do with our genetic disposition, and perhaps somewhat to do with the experiences that have shaped us through this life, perhaps, but it has everything to do with how much we know Jesus. So if I were facing a storm, I would look to friends for encouragement, I would pray, I would seek the Lord, I would do all of those things, but I would immerse myself in the Gospels. Because the issue is not the comfort from Jesus, the issue is the character of Jesus. This is the issue that you're facing right now and that I am. Does Jesus have enough comfort? Does he have enough character to navigate me through this? Well, if he does, you can trust him. But you don't trust somebody you don't know. And when I break down and fail, lose my faith, it's not because I just didn't have enough wits about me to make it through, but rather it's because I was not as intimately aware of the character of Jesus. I didn't know and trust him in that moment. When we read the Psalms, I often quote an Old Testament scholar by the name of Walter Brueggemann. Maybe you've heard me say this. I said it so many times when we were doing the Psalms on Sunday nights, and then a couple of years ago we did the Psalms in the summer. And he says, as you're reading the Psalms, you have to understand that the psalmist is moving through 3 stages. This is a helpful way to understand the Psalms, and I think a helpful way to understand this passage of Scripture. The first is orientation. So think of Psalm 23. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. We orient our lives in a certain direction. The disciples got in a boat, and they oriented the boat toward Capernaum. That was the direction in which they were heading. But at some point in life, we become disoriented. So, right, we could all share stories on a macro level where our life was thrown a curve, or on a micro level, and this is what happened to the disciples. The storm swells up. And what does Jesus do in that moment? Well, Jesus did not fix what a psychologist would call the presenting issues. They didn't fix what was on the surface. He didn't fix immediately what thought they were going on in their life. He didn't resolve that. He didn't meet their emotional needs right away, and he didn't calm the seas. So there's orientation, disorientation. What God does is, this is the most important part, is reorientation. Reorientation. This is the story of the Psalms. God reorients us to another way of existence. And this is the story of the Gospels. Jesus comes, he lives a sinless life, his disciples follow him, they're heavily persecuted. Jesus didn't say, look, you oriented your life toward me, now you're disoriented because you're facing these troubles, but I just want to tell you everything's going to be all right. Don't worry about it. He doesn't fix their circumstances. He dies on the cross and he rises again, and they give the rest of their lives giving themselves for that message. They reorient themselves to a whole new way of existence. Jesus didn't fix the boat, and Jesus didn't fix the storm. What he did is he fixed his disciples. For the rest of their life, there will never, ever be a moment where they forget that Jesus Christ is the great I am. And that's the place to which he wanted to reorient them. So, true disciples are entrusted with trials so they'll know and trust Jesus. So be encouraged this morning. You're a true disciple, not in the crowd. And be encouraged that you can seek the Lord. You can bring him into that situation, and be encouraged, ultimately, most of all, to know and trust Jesus. Understand that he has the character to sustain us during whatever he calls us to endure.